Hi, I'm Marc Lynch, Director of the Institute for Middle East Studies and the Project on Middle East Political Science at the George Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, our series of discussions with leading scholars about their work, their careers, and their new books. With me today is James Toth of NYU Abu Dhabi and the American University of Sharjah. And he's the author of the new book, Sayyid Qutb, The Life and Times of Radical Islamic Intellectual. And welcome, Jim. Welcome to GW.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here because, back when I was in graduate school, you were one of the few people who was writing about Upper Egypt and the flow of money and people and ideas from the Gulf into Upper Egypt. And I really learned a lot from what you were writing at the time. When you look back at what you were doing then and where we are today, what jumps out at you?
Well, the Sayyid is the poorest part of Egypt. The south has been underdeveloped. It's the southern question that Gramsci had to deal with southern Italy. And so the Sayyidis, the southerners, South Egyptians, migrated overseas during the oil boom in much greater numbers, as a greater percentage than elsewhere in the country. And they came back more discontented with the system, so that when you see the Islamic movement developing there, as I was doing with my field research, you see a combination of that frustration. You see the influence of the Gulf Islam, which is more conservative than even Egypt. You see the tribalism, which is still resilient in that part of the country as opposed to the Delta, and of course more than the cities. And so all of that combined then, I think, gives the militancy there a very interesting flavor. Then when they migrate to Cairo and Alexandria, mostly to Cairo, like in Baba, then when the government begins to shut down Islamic organizations, it becomes much more tense, it becomes more violent. And so I think that the southern Egyptian culture then helps color the movement as a whole.
Now, you were in Upper Egypt from the early 1980s all the way into the 1990s. Could you see this developing at the time? I mean, did you see changes in the way people dressed or the way they talked about Islam? What were the manifestations of these changes?
Well, they were in one way more cosmopolitan because of the migration overseas, but they came back more conservative. They were influenced by the Wahhabi Islam of Saudi Arabia and the conservative Islam of the Gulf. And so the lifestyle changed because they were earning good money in the Gulf, which they couldn't get back in Egypt, and that was one of their concerns. But they had a better lifestyle. They realized their position in Egyptian society better afterwards than before. And it created a greater sense of frustration. Even now they're trying to pass bills in Parliament that would help give the Sayyid, the South, greater priority in Egypt's development plan. So it hasn't changed any. Before, about 40% were under the poverty line, and it's very close, if not greater, today. So despite this migration to the Gulf and their rise in their levels of consumption, there's still a great deal of frustration and worry about the Egyptian economy as a whole.
And a lot of that money goes into clinics and social services and all those sorts of things. Does that just replace government action, or what is the social role of these clinics, dating back 30, 40 years?
Well, one of the pillars, as we know, of Islam is zakat, of giving donations to the poor. And so under the label of zakat, people have given to Islamic clinics, to Islamic private schools, clothing, pre-owned clothing, we call it, textbooks, hospital beds, youth centers, even help in the bureaucracy from like-minded citizens who are bureaucrats. So that's all under the name of good deeds under Islam. And so, what was your second question then?
Well, just the social role of these clinics. I mean, is there people? Some people think this helps to spread Islam.
They do replace the government because since the economic adjustment, the SAPs, the structural adjustment programs with the IMF, it's forced the government to reduce its budget. The government has not funded clinics and schools to the level that are necessary. So then these become very necessary and appreciated additions to the political economy in the South.
Now, typically, though, these were not Muslim Brotherhood, right? These were other Islamic associations.
They're not really mutually exclusive. They were small organizations, the Light of the Prophet or the Prophet's Daughter, or benevolent societies that were there to bring in zakat, to bring in these donations, often attached to mosques, private mosques, and established to do this community development. So that there's been a tradition of this for some time.
Now, when you were at the American University of Cairo and you're going down to Upper Egypt to do your research, how would you characterize the gaps or the differences between the two societies that you were seeing? Between and I specifically mean the communities of Upper Egyptians in Cairo versus the people who are still back in Upper Egypt?
Well, I think a good indicator of the difference is in the presidential election for Morsi. The Sayyid was overwhelmingly 70–80% for Morsi. Cairo went for Shafiq. And the Delta was spotty, but it was very much, I think it did do Morsi, but very narrow. Because many of the military and police are recruited from the Delta. Alexandria has a mix of cosmopolitan and rural to urban migrants, so it went, again, it was just barely Morsi. And then the canal cities. Also, I think Port Said went for Shafiq and the other two went for Morsi. So you can see in that the South is very much into themselves. There's a populism of southern Egypt, just like there is in this country, where the South is proud of its roots. They smile at the Saidi jokes like our Polish jokes, but it's also a sense of pride that they're family-oriented, they embrace those traditions, they embrace their sort of conservative Islam, and they sort of look down on their richer cousins up north as being richer, but also more secular.
Now, I know you're not living there right now, but looking at what's happening now, do you think that there's a prospect of a return to 1990s style insurgency?
Yes. There's not going to be an Algeria. I don't think that's going to happen, but there are going to be organizations that probably spin off from the Brotherhood, like there were in the 80s and 90s, who disagree with the Brotherhood's embrace of democracy and parliamentarism and want to go into a more militant direction. Not connected so much with what's happening in Sinai. That's really, I think, quite different. It is building on a tribalism and detribalization. So that's quite different than Cairo, but I think the South, there will be people who say, once again, we've been slapped in the face as we've been for many decades, and this is their way of trying to establish a better system.
Right. Let's go to Sayyid Qutb and your book. And actually, let's connect the two threads of the discussion. What do you think Sayyid Qutb would say today about conditions in Egypt?
Well, Qutb was from the south of Egypt. He was further south than where I lived. And he came to Cairo and he was a modernist. In fact, he was super modern and then began to realize sort of the error of his ways through his own thinking. I think he would, many of his followers remained in the Muslim Brotherhood. Those who were more into democracy as we know it, spun off from the Brotherhood and established the Freedom and Justice Party, the Current Party, the Wasat Center Party, and these different parties were those who disagreed with that Qutb direction. The Brotherhood on the one hand is worried about splintering, but what that has done is a sort of purification of homogenizing the core that's left in the Brotherhood of being fairly radical. I don't think they're going in his militant direction. I just don't think that's in the cards. But I think they will mount a more Qutbist type of critique of what's going on than in the past. Sorry.
In the book, you describe Qutb's ideology as very hostile to political parties, to democracy, for I think fairly familiar reasons, but you really connect it to his idea of the ideal society and the rejection of divisions, that Islam must remain unified. And yet, not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but Salafis, in fact, most of the Islamic trends actually participated in the parliamentary elections, formed political parties. So you might have said 2 years ago, this is the lowest ebb of Qutb's ideological influence. And yet now, I think what you're saying is that he's likely to have a resurgence. Is that right?
Within certain groups who say our efforts at participating in the democratic process are useless because look where it got us. We're being arrested, we're being repressed, and we're being outlawed, perhaps even worse than when Mubarak was around. So I think this is giving fuel to those who are saying we should never have done this in the first place. And then those who did do that, who spun off and created parties, are ones who want to take, this is a way of having access to power and being in positions of authority where we can realize the Islamic state that we want, the Islamic society we want. So it's different understandings of how we go from start to finish, and some want to do it democratically and others see that as useless.
Do you think that at the time that Mohammed Morsi is becoming president and the Muslim Brotherhood is dominating parliament, is there any sense in which this was okay with Sayyid Qutb? In other words, that he would have approved of what they were doing, or would this have simply been outside of his ideological understanding of Islam?
Well, what was it? The Building and Development Party, which was the old Gema Islamiyah, which renounced violence in 1996, and then became accepted, to part of civil society, that they could be develop their party and participate, and they continued to renounce violence, but they're also very disenchanted with what's going on. So I think Qutb, like many of the brothers, they promised not to run candidates in parliament as many as they did. They were not going to mount a presidential candidate. They did. They broke those promises. But I can't blame them because they were probably intoxicated with the power and the recognition they had, and that meant a lot to them.
So you expect a resurgence in Sayyid Qutb book sales, or at least illegal downloads?
Well, Oxford Press has made that connection, and I did too with the epigram in the book and the cover, that this is more connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. Sayyid Qutb didn't become a member of the Muslim Brotherhood till late in life, and he was an independent intellectual up to that point. And so I think he would say, okay, the Muslim Brotherhood is the better vehicle, but perhaps not the best. So there could be better, but he would hitch his wagon to their star in order to get where they want to go.
All right, thank you. Jim Toth of NYU Abu Dhabi and the American University of Sharjah, author of the new book, Sayyid Qutb. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Marc.